The Miami evening was warm, the kind that clings to your skin like silk. Robert Chambers drove his midnight blue Lexus along the palm-lined streets of Coral Gables, the windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of jasmine that perfumed the air. Soft jazz played from the speakers. Miles Davis, the soundtrack to his evening drive home from the university where he now taught constitutional law 3 days a week. At 65, Robert carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent his life in service to justice. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close, his posture still military, straight from his days in the J.H. Corps before law school. 2 terms as Florida's first black state attorney, General had etched fine lines around his eyes, but had done nothing to dim their sharp intelligence. He slowed as he approached a 4-way stop, coming to a complete halt before proceeding. Old habits. He had always been meticulous about traffic laws, even when he'd had the power to make them disappear. The road ahead was clear, just the glow of streetlights illuminating the manicured lawns of one of Miami's most exclusive neighborhoods. In his rearview mirror, blue and red lights suddenly flashed to life. Robert checked his speedometer. He had been going exactly the speed limit. Perhaps a taillight was out. He signaled and pulled to the side of the road, the tires of his Lexus crunching on the immaculate shoulder. He reached for his wallet, removed his driver's license, then took his registration from the glove compartment. Through his side mirror, he watched as 2 officers emerged from the patrol car. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, with a swagger to his walk, the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. His nameplate read Cowell Lance. The second officer was shorter, nervous energy radiating from him as he scanned the surrounding area. Behind them, almost as an afterthought, a third officer exited the vehicle. Young female, her movements hesitant. Taras, a rookie, Robert guessed. Robert lowered his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. The scent of the night air was replaced by the sharp tang of tension. "Good evening, officers," Robert said, his voice deep and measured. The kind of voice that had commanded courtrooms and press conferences, that had announced indictments against corrupt officials and promised justice to victims' families. Officer Collins leaned down, flashlight beams sweeping across the interior of the Lexus before settling deliberately on Robert's face. "License and registration," Collins said, not bothering to respond to the greeting. His tone was flat, dismissive. Robert handed over the documents. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" Collins studied the license, his expression unchanging. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." "What description would that be?" Robert asked, keeping his tone neutral. Collins's eyes flicked up, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." "I'd like to know on what grounds you're asking me to exit my vehicle," Robert said. "I'm not asking," Collins replied, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "Step out now." Robert took a slow, deep breath. He had been here before, not personally, but he had seen the reports, heard the testimonies, represented the families. He knew this script all too well. "Officer Collins," he said, noting how the use of the man's name caused a slight tensing in the officer's jaw. "I'd like to speak with your supervising officer." "Out." "Off." "The car." Each word was punctuated with increasing hostility. Robert unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out, he stood to his full height, 6'2", still fit despite his years. He wore a tailored navy suit, white shirt, and crimson-tied his teaching attire. His university ID badge was still clipped to his breast pocket. "Sir, turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Collins instructed. "Officer, I'm Robert Chambers, former State Attorney General of Florida. I've done nothing wrong, and I do not consent to a search." Collins's laugh was short and harsh. "Former Attorney General. Right, and I'm the governor. Hands on the car now." Robert didn't move. "I will comply with lawful orders, Officer Collins, but I would like to understand the basis for this stop." "Last warning," Collins said, his hand now fully on his weapon. Behind him, Officer Torres shifted uncomfortably. Officer Mercer stepped forward, aggressive energy coiled in his movements. "Listen, buddy," Mercer said. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Robert slowly placed his hands on the roof of his car. "I'm complying." but I want it noted that I do not consent to any searches." Collins began patting him down, roughly, invasively, while Mercer circled to the passenger side and peered in through the window. "Pop the trunk," Collins demanded. "No," Robert said firmly. "You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle." Collins's smile was cold. "Actually, I do. I smell marijuana." Robert knew the tactic well, the phantom odor that couldn't be disproven, the universal key to warrantless searches. "There is no marijuana in my vehicle or on my person. I'd like to call my attorney." "You can call whoever you want after we're done here," Collins said, reaching into Robert's pocket and removing his phone. He handed it to Mercer, who placed it on the roof of the patrol car. Officer Torres had remained by the patrol car, her hand resting uncertainly on her notepad. Her eyes darted between her fellow officers and Robert, a furrow of concern deepening between her brows. Mercer checked the car. Collins ordered, "Torres, get the kit from the trunk." Torres hesitated. "The kit? You heard me," Collins snapped. Something in his tone made Robert's skin prickle. He had prosecuted enough corrupt cops in his career to recognize the signs. This wasn't just harassment. Something more was happening here. Mercer was already rummaging through Robert's car, pulling out the contents of the glove compartment, opening the center console. "Clean so far," he called out. Torres returned with a small black case, which she handed to Collins with visible reluctance. Collins took it and gestured for her to step back. He opened the case out of Robert's line of sight. "Sir," Torres spoke suddenly, her voice surprisingly steady, "I'm going to activate my body camera now." Collins's head snapped toward her. "What did you say?" "Protocol, sir," she replied. "Any search requires documented footage." Collins stared at her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Fine, do it." Robert caught Torres's eye briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She reached up and tapped her camera. "Sir." Collins addressed Robert again. "I need you to turn around." Robert complied. Collins stepped forward, his body blocking Torres's camera view. In one swift motion, he reached into his own pocket, then bent down near Robert's feet. When he straightened, he was holding a small plastic bag containing white powder. Well, what do we have here?" Collins said loudly. "Looks like we've got a possession charge." Robert stared at the bag, then at Collins. "You just planted that. It wasn't there and it's not mine." "Save it for the judge," Collins smirked. "You have the right to remain silent." As Collins continued with the Miranda warning, Robert's mind was already racing through the legal strategies, the calls he would make, the storm that was about to break. But it was Officer Torres who spoke next, her voice cutting through Collins's recitation. "Sir, I need to speak with you privately." Collins turned to her, incredulous. "What?" "It's important, sir, now." Her tone left no room for argument. Collins glared at her, then barked at Mercer to watch Robert. He walked Torres a few paces away, their heated whispers just out of earshot. Robert stood silently, watching the dynamic. Torres was gesturing toward her body camera, her posture growing increasingly rigid as Collins leaned into her space, intimidating. Something was happening, a conflict of conscience, a breach in the blue wall. After a tense minute, Collins stormed back, fury evident in every line of his body. "Get in the car, Chambers. Now." As Robert was guided into the back of the patrol car, he caught a glimpse of Torres's face. She looked pale, resolute, and very afraid. But something else was there too, determination. The ride to the station was silent, heavy with unspoken threats and calculations. Robert sat perfectly still, his mind clear despite the gravity of his situation. He had spent decades prosecuting crimes, defending the law, reforming a system resistant to change. He knew what happened in the shadows, in the spaces between written reports, but he also knew that truth had a power all its own, especially when witnessed by those brave enough to speak it. And in Officer Alicia Torres's eyes, he had recognized that rarest of things in moments like these, a witness willing to stand on the side of truth, no matter the cost. As the patrol car pulled into the station parking lot, Robert made a silent promise to himself and to the principles he had served his entire career. This would not stand. Not just for him, but for everyone who had faced this kind of injustice without his resources, his knowledge, his power to fight back. This was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning. The precinct hummed with late, night energy, the fluorescent buzz of overhead lights, the click of keyboards, the low murmur of officers processing the evening's arrests. Robert sat on a metal bench, his back straight, his eyes taking in every detail. No handcuffs, a small courtesy due to his calm compliance, or perhaps Torres's quiet intervention. Through a glass partition, he could see Collins and Mercer in animated discussion with a sergeant. Torres stood slightly apart, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Twice, the sergeant glanced toward Robert, his expression shifting from dismissive to uncertain. Robert recognized the look. It was the face of a man realizing that routine arrest might not be so routine after all. A door opened and a man in a rumpled suit approached. Late 40s, bags under his eyes, coffee stain on his tie, a detective who had seen too many long nights. "Mr. Chambers," the detective said, extending his hand. "I'm Detective Garcia. There seems to be some confusion about your situation." Robert didn't take the offered hand. "There's no confusion, Detective. Your officers conducted an illegal stop, planted evidence, and attempted to falsely arrest me. The only confusion is why I'm still sitting here instead of watching them surrender their badges." Garcia's eyebrows rose slightly. "Those are serious allegations. They're factual statements, backed by body camera footage. If Officer Torres's equipment was functioning properly." Robert's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath the calm. "I'd like to make my phone call now." Garcia studied him for a long moment. "That won't be necessary. You're not under arrest. I was read my Miranda rights and brought here in a patrol car against my will." Robert pointed out, "That constitutes an arrest in the eyes of the law. As you well know, a misunderstanding." Garcia offered weakly. "Hardly." Robert stood, straightening his suit jacket. "I want to file a formal complaint against Officers Collins and Mercer. I want it noted that they conducted an unlawful stop, searched my vehicle without consent or probable cause, and planted evidence with the intent to make a false arrest." Garcia's expression tightened. "Mr. Chambers." "State Attorney General Chambers," Robert corrected, his patience wearing thin. "I held that office for 2 terms, and while I no longer carry the title officially, I believe it's relevant to this conversation." The change was immediate. Garcia's posture stiffened, his eyes widening slightly. "I wasn't informed of your former position." "Clearly," Robert said dryly. "Now, about that complaint." "Let me speak with the captain," Garcia said, retreating toward an office at the back of the room. Left alone again, Robert noticed Torres watching him through the glass. Their eyes met, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough to confirm what Robert had suspected. She had seen something, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. 10 minutes later, a door opened, and a man with captain's bars on his uniform emerged. Behind him trailed Garcia, Collins, Mercer, and Torres. The captain's face was a careful mask of professional concern. "Mr. Chambers," he began, "I'm Captain Reynolds. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced tonight." "Inconvenience?" Robert repeated, his tone making the word sound like what it was a gross understatement. "Captain, your officers committed multiple violations of department policy and federal law tonight. That goes well beyond inconvenience." Reynolds' smile grew strained. "We're looking into the matter. In the meantime, you're free to go. Detective Garcia will drive you back to your vehicle, and the narcotics supposedly found in my possession." A flicker of discomfort crossed Reynolds' face. "There seems to have been some irregularity with the evidence. We won't be pursuing any charges." "Irregularity?" Robert echoed. An interesting choice of words for what occurred. Reynolds lowered his voice. "Mercer, Chambers, I understand you're upset. If you'd like to discuss this further, perhaps we could meet tomorrow, after everyone has had a chance to review the situation more thoroughly." Robert recognized the tactic: delay, cool down, hope the problem goes away. It was the same approach that had buried countless legitimate complaints against officers throughout his career. "I'll be filing my complaint tonight," Robert said firmly. "And Captain Reynolds, you should know that I'll be pursuing every available avenue to ensure accountability in this matter." Reynolds' professional veneer cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake." "No," Robert replied, looking directly at Collins and Mercer, who stood stiffly behind their captain. The mistake was made when your officers decided I was an easy target. The ride back to Robert's car was silent. Garcia attempted small talk once, then gave up in the face of Robert's focused silence. When they arrived, Robert stepped out of the detective's car without a backward glance, got into his Lexus, and drove home. It was past midnight when he entered his house, a modest but elegant colonial in Coconut Grove, filled with books and memories from a life devoted to public service. He didn't turn on the lights immediately. Instead, he stood in the darkness of his living room, letting the events of the evening settle over him. Then he walked to his home office, turned on his computer, and began typing. He documented everything: the time of the stop, the officers' names, the exact sequence of events, every word spoken. When he finished, it was nearly 2 in the morning. He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Hello." The voice on the other end was groggy with sleep. "Michael, it's Robert Chambers. I apologize for the late hour, but I need your help." Michael Washington had been Robert's deputy during his second term as Attorney General. Now he headed the state's most prestigious civil rights law firm. "Robert, what's happened?" "I was just subjected to a textbook case of racial profiling, complete with planted evidence. I need to file more than just a complaint. I want to go after them with everything we've got." There was a pause, then Michael's voice came back, fully alert now. "Tell me everything." As Robert recounted the evening's events, he could hear Michael taking notes, asking clarifying questions. When he finished, Michael was silent for a moment. "We'll need the body camera footage," he finally said. "If this Officer Torres was recording, that's our key piece of evidence. And if they try to bury it, they can't. Not legally. But they might try to delay, claim technical issues, hope we give up." Robert's jaw tightened. "I don't give up, Michael. You know that?" "I do," Michael agreed. "And that's what they should be afraid of. I'll file the formal requests first thing in the morning. In the meantime, write down every detail while it's fresh." "Already done. That's why you were the boss," Michael said, a smile in his voice despite the gravity of the situation. "Get some rest, Robert. Tomorrow, we go to war." After hanging up, Robert sat in the quiet of his office, staring at the wall of framed photographs that chronicled his career. His swearing in as Attorney General, shaking hands with 2 different presidents, standing with community leaders, after prosecuting a notorious white supremacist group. His eyes lingered on one photo in particular, himself as a young assistant prosecutor, standing on the courthouse steps with his mentor, Judge William Thompson, the first black federal judge in Florida's history. Thompson's words came back to him now, as clear as the day they were spoken. "Justice isn't just about winning cases, Robert. It's about changing systems." Robert nodded to himself. This wasn't just about what had happened to him tonight. It was about every person who had faced the same treatment without his resources, his knowledge, his platform to fight back. Tomorrow, he would begin that fight not just for himself, but for the principle that had guided his entire career: justice. Blind to color, deaf to privilege, beholden only to truth. As he finally went to bed in the early hours of the morning, Robert Chambers knew one thing with absolute certainty. What had happened tonight would not be buried, explained away, or forgotten. It would be exposed, examined, and used to force change in a system that had resisted it for far too long. The story was just beginning. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect Miami spring day that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. Robert rose early, despite his late night. Decades of public service had conditioned him to function on minimal sleep when necessary. He dressed meticulously: a charcoal suit, powder blue shirt, silver tie. Armor in its way. His father, who had cleaned office buildings at night while studying for his teaching degree, had always said, "Dress like they can't ignore you." It was advice Robert had carried with him from the projects of Chicago to the highest legal office in Florida. His phone rang as he was making coffee. "Michael Washington." "I've started the paperwork," Michael said without preamble. "But there's something you should know. I have a contact in internal affairs at Miami PD. Collins and Mercer have 3 other complaints filed against them in the past year, all from black or Hispanic men. all alleging illegal searches or excessive force, all dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Robert wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still settled like a weight in his chest. And Torres, rookie, 8 months on the force, graduated top of her class at the academy. No complaints, commended twice for de-escalation tactics. She's the key, Robert said, stirring his coffee absently. She saw what happened. If she's willing to talk, Michael cautioned. The blue wall is real, Robert. Even with your profile, even with your connections, they'll close ranks. Every wall has cracks, Robert replied. We just need to find them. After hanging up, Robert checked his email. Already, Michael had sent over the formal complaints they would file, one with the department's Internal Affairs Division, one with the Civilian Oversight Board, largely toothless but necessary for the paper trail, and one with the State Attorney's Office requesting criminal charges for evidence tampering and civil rights violations. Robert reviewed each document carefully, made a few annotations, and sent them back. Then he made another call to his former press secretary, now a political consultant. Sandra, I need your advice on media strategy. Something has happened that I think the public needs to know about. By noon, the first formal complaints had been filed. By 2 o'clock, Robert was sitting across from the current state attorney, a woman named Diane Perez whom he had once mentored. This is explosive, Robert, Diane said after reading through his account. You're essentially alleging that 2 officers fabricated evidence and attempted to frame the former top prosecutor in the state. Not essentially, Robert corrected. That's exactly what I'm alleging, because that's exactly what happened. And I want to know what you're going to do about it. Diane sighed, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. You know the challenges. It will be your word against theirs. Except for Officer Torres, Robert reminded her, and the body camera footage, which we haven't seen yet, Diane pointed out, and which could mysteriously malfunction or go missing. Is that the official position of the state attorney's office now? Assuming evidence will be corrupted, so why bother pursuing justice? Robert's tone was sharp. Diane's eyes flashed. That's not fair, Rombo, he agreed. It's not fair. Neither is what happened to me last night, or what happens to countless others who don't have my platform. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Diane was silent for a long moment. I'll assign my best prosecutor to review the case. I'll personally request the body camera footage and all relevant evidence. But Robert, I can't promise anything beyond that. The burden of proof. I'm well aware of the burden of proof, Diane. I carried it for 8 years in this very office. She nodded. I'll do everything by the book. You have my word. The book has failed too many people, Robert said, rising to leave. Sometimes, justice requires writing new chapters. As he left the office that had once been his, Robert knew that the official channels would move slowly, if at all. The system was designed to protect itself, to absorb and diffuse challenges, to exhaust complainants until they simply gave up. But Robert Chambers had no intention of giving up. Not now, not ever. His next stop was a small Cuban cafe in Little Havana, where he had arranged to meet with Sandra Chen, his former press secretary. She was waiting for him, a portfolio open on the table, her expression shifting between professional concern and personal outrage as he recounted the previous night's events. This needs to go public, she said when he finished. Not just a press release, not just a statement. We need to make this impossible to ignore. I agree, Robert said, but we need to be strategic. If we go too big too fast, they'll dig in. We need to build pressure gradually, force them to respond, then catch them in their contradictions. Sandra nodded, already taking notes. We start with select outlets, ones with credibility and reach. We focus on the facts, your background, the pattern of complaints against these officers. We don't make it just about you, we make it about the system. Exactly. Robert agreed, and we need to find others. If Collins and Mercer did this to me, they've done it to others. We need those stories. I can help with that, Sandra said. I still have contacts at several community organizations. They might know people who've had encounters with these officers. As they finalized their strategy, Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Update, request for body cam footage denied. Citing ongoing investigation. Filing emergency motion with the court. Robert showed the message to Sandra, whose lips thinned. They're already circling the wagons. As expected, Robert said. But every denial, every delay, only strengthens our case in the court of public opinion. They think they're protecting themselves, but they're actually building our narrative for us. After finishing with Sandra, Robert had one more stop to make. He drove to the University of Miami School of Law, where he taught 3 days a week. He had a class scheduled that evening: constitutional law and civil rights, an advanced seminar for third-year students. He would not cancel it. On the contrary, he would use it. The classroom was full when he arrived. 25 future lawyers, a diverse group representing the changing face of the legal profession. They fell silent as he entered, perhaps sensing something different in his demeanor. "Good evening," he began. "I had planned to discuss the evolution of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence tonight. As it happens, I now have a first-hand case study to share with you." For the next 30 minutes, he detailed the previous night's events clinically, analytically, as if it had happened to someone else. His students listened in stunned silence. "This," he concluded, "is why what we do in this classroom matters. This is why the principles we discuss aren't abstract theories but vital protections that only work when people fight for them. The Constitution doesn't enforce itself. Laws don't apply themselves. People, lawyers, judges, citizens must demand that the system lives up to its promises." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Professor Chambers, what can we do to help?" Robert looked at her, at all of them, and saw not just students but allies. Future defenders of the principles he had spent his life upholding. "Pay attention," he told them. "Document everything. Watch what happens next, not just the official statements, but the spaces between them. The attempts to distract, to minimize, to redirect. This is how systems protect themselves. Understanding that is the first step to changing it." As class ended, several students lingered, offering support, asking questions. One young man approached last, hanging back until the others had gone. "Professor," he said quietly, "my brother had an encounter with Officer Collins last year. Very similar to what you described. They found drugs that weren't his. He's still on probation because he couldn't fight it effectively." Robert's expression remained composed, but his resolve hardened. "Would your brother be willing to talk to me and my attorney?" The student hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. I'll ask him." "Thank you," Robert said, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. His story matters. All of these stories matter. As he drove home that evening, Robert reflected on the day's developments. The official channels were already throwing up roadblocks. The department was closing ranks, but cracks were appearing. Torres's apparent willingness to tell the truth. The student's brother. The potential for other victims to come forward. Tomorrow, the first news stories would break. The pressure would begin to build. The department would be forced to respond, to defend, to explain. And in those explanations, Robert knew from long experience, lay the seeds of their undoing. Because lies, even official ones, had a way of unraveling when pulled by determined hands. As he reached his driveway, Robert noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street, a modest sedan with a single occupant. He couldn't make out the driver's features in the gathering dusk, but the posture was alert, watchful. Message received. They were letting him know he was being watched. Robert didn't react visibly. He simply parked, entered his house, and went about his evening routine as if nothing were amiss. But inside, a cold anger was building, not the hot, destructive kind that clouded judgment, but the focused, clarifying kind that had fueled his most successful prosecutions. They thought they could intimidate him. They thought they could make him back down. They had no idea who they were dealing with. By the end of the week, the story had exploded. What began as a carefully placed exclusive in the Miami Herald had quickly spread to national outlets. Former State Attorney General alleges police corruption. Read the headlines. Robert's distinguished career, his reputation for integrity, and his work on police reform made the allegations impossible to dismiss. The Miami Police Department issued a terse statement. "We take all allegations seriously. and are conducting a thorough investigation. We cannot comment further on an ongoing matter. But the pressure continued to build. Michael Washington filed a lawsuit not just against the officers, but against the department itself, alleging systemic issues and a pattern of racial profiling. The complaint named Collins, Mercer, Captain Reynolds, and the police chief as defendants. Community organizations rallied around the case. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, carrying signs reading, "Justice for Chambers, justice for Al," and no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. 5 days after the incident, Robert received a call from Michael. "We've got movement," Michael said, excitement evident in his voice. "Officer Torres has agreed to give a statement to Internal Affairs, and according to my source, she's confirming everything, the illegal stop, the planted evidence, all of it." That took courage, Robert remarked, feeling a surge of respect for the young officer. "It gets better," Michael continued. 3 more people have come forward with similar stories about Collins and Mercer. All with documentation, court records, booking photos, the works, and one of them had the presence of mind to record audio of his encounter. Not admissible in court under Florida's 2-party consent law, but damning in the court of public opinion. "Release it," Robert decided. "All of it. Let the public see the pattern, already in motion." Michael assured him, "Press conference tomorrow at 10. You should be there. Your presence lends credibility to their stories." "I'll be there," Robert promised. The next morning, as Robert prepared to leave for the press conference, he noticed the same sedan parked across from his house. It had been there every day, a silent attempt at intimidation. But now there was a second car, unmarked, but unmistakably police. As he walked to his Lexus, the door of the unmarked car opened and Captain Reynolds emerged. "Mr. Chambers," he called, approaching the driveway. "A moment of your time, please." Robert paused, keys in hand. "Captain, to what do I owe this visit?" Reynolds glanced around, as if checking for witnesses or recording devices. "I thought we might discuss a resolution to this situation. Off the record." "There's nothing to discuss off the record," Robert replied. "My allegations are clear, and they're now part of both an internal affairs investigation and a civil lawsuit." Reynolds stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Be reasonable, Chambers. You've made your point. The department is willing to make changes. Collins and Mercer can be reassigned, even suspended for a time, but taking this further only hurts everyone, the department, the community, even you." "Is that a threat, Captain?" "A reality check," Reynolds corrected. "You're making powerful enemies. Even with your connections, that's dangerous territory." Robert studied him for a moment. "Let me be perfectly clear, Captain Reynolds. I've prosecuted corrupt cops, white supremacists, and organized crime figures. I've received death threats from people far more intimidating than you or your officers. If you think I can be scared into silence, you've gravely misjudged me." Reynolds's expression hardened. "Then you've made your choice. Don't say you weren't warned." "Actually," Robert said, reaching into his pocket and removing a small digital recorder, "I think you just made yours. Attempting to intimidate a witness is a felony in Florida, as you well know." Reynolds's face paled slightly as he stared at the recorder. "Now," Robert continued, "if you'll excuse me, I have a press conference to attend." As he drove away, he could see Reynolds still standing in his driveway, a mixture of anger and fear on his face. The captain had just made a critical error, one that would cost him dearly. The press conference was held on the steps of the courthouse, where Robert had prosecuted hundreds of cases during his career. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Michael had assembled 5 individuals, each with their own story of encounters with Collins and Mercer, including the student's brother, whom Robert had mentioned in his class. One by one, they told their stories. A business owner who was stopped and searched while driving home from a late meeting. A medical student who had drugs planted in his car after he questioned why he was being pulled over. A retiree who was physically assaulted during what should have been a routine traffic stop. When it was Robert's turn to speak, the crowd of reporters fell silent. "What connects these stories, my story, and the stories you've just heard, is not just the officers involved, but the system that protected them," he began, A system that dismisses complaints, that closes ranks, that values loyalty over integrity and power over justice. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. I was Attorney General of this state for 8 years. I prosecuted corrupt officials, fought for police reform, and believed in the possibility of a just system. What happened to me last week has not changed that belief, but it has reminded me that justice requires eternal vigilance. It requires us to speak truth to power, especially when that power wears a badge. The questions came rapid fire after that. Would he demand the officers be fired? Was he calling for the police chief's resignation? What reforms was he seeking? Robert answered each one with the precision and clarity that had made him a formidable prosecutor. This isn't about individual officers, though they must be held accountable, he explained. This is about a culture that allows such behavior to flourish. We need independent oversight with real teeth. We need mandatory body cameras with footage accessible to the public. We need civilian review boards with the power to discipline officers. And most importantly, we need leaders willing to break through the blue wall of silence instead of hiding behind it. As the press conference concluded, a commotion at the back of the crowd drew attention. Officer Alicia Torres, in civilian clothes, was making her way forward. The reporters parted, sensing another chapter to the story. Torres approached Robert, extended her hand. Mr. Chambers, I wanted you to know that I gave my statement this morning. The full statement, everything I saw. Robert shook her hand. That took courage, Officer Torres. She nodded, swallowing hard. They've placed me on administrative leave, supposedly for my protection, but we both know that's not the real reason. Retaliation. Robert said, not as a question but as a confirmation. Yes, sir. Her voice was steady despite the cost she was clearly paying. But I couldn't stay silent. Not after what I saw, not if I want to look at myself in the mirror every morning. The reporters were furiously taking notes, cameras capturing every word of this unexpected exchange. Officer Torres, one called out, are you saying your department is punishing you for telling the truth? She turned to face the cameras. I'm saying that I took an oath to uphold the law and protect the public. That oath doesn't have exceptions based on who's wearing the uniform. It was a powerful moment, one that would lead every newscast that evening. The honest cop, punished for breaking the code of silence. The visual was perfect. Torres, young and idealistic, standing alongside Robert Chambers, the embodiment of legal gravitas and integrity. Michael Washington, ever the strategist, stepped forward. Officer Torres has demonstrated the kind of courage we need in our police force. We're adding her situation to our lawsuit as a clear case of whistleblower retaliation. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted follow-up questions, Robert placed a supportive hand on Torres's shoulder and guided her away from the chaos. My car is over here, he said quietly. Let's talk somewhere more private. They drove to a small park overlooking Biscayne Bay. The water glittered under the afternoon sun, sailboats cutting white paths across the blue expanse. Away from the cameras and microphones, Torres seemed smaller, the weight of her decision visibly heavy on her shoulders. They're going to come after me hard, she said, staring out at the water. My sergeant already called me a traitor to the badge. My locker was vandalized this morning. Robert nodded. He had seen it before, the swift, brutal response to those who broke ranks. Why did you do it? You could have stayed quiet, looked the other way like everyone else. Torres was silent for a long moment. My father was arrested when I was 12. Possession with intent to distribute. Except he didn't have any drugs, he was a janitor. Worked 2 jobs to support us after my mom died. Her voice caught slightly. The officer who arrested him planted the evidence. Dad spent 2 years in prison before another officer finally came forward. By then, we'd lost our apartment. I'd been in foster care. She shook her head. I became a cop to make sure that didn't happen to another family. And my first year on the force, I watched Collins do exactly what destroyed my family. Robert felt a surge of respect for the young officer. Your testimony is crucial, but it's going to be a difficult road. I know, she said. But I've been down difficult roads before. You won't be alone this time, Robert promised. As they parted, Robert realized that Torres represented something vital, proof that even within a flawed system, integrity could survive. She was the crack in the blue wall that might, with enough pressure, bring the whole structure down. The next morning, Robert woke to news that Chief of Police Richard Monroe had called an emergency press conference. Sitting in his living room, cup of coffee cooling beside him, Robert watched as Monroe, silver-haired, square-jawed, the picture of authority, addressed the gathered media. The Miami Police Department holds itself to the highest standards of professionalism and ethical conduct. Monroe began, his voice betraying no emotion. The allegations made by former State Attorney General Chambers are deeply troubling and deserve a complete and transparent investigation. Robert raised an eyebrow. This wasn't the dismissive response he had expected. To that end, Monroe continued, "I have placed Officers Collins and Mercer on administrative leave pending the outcome of both the internal affairs investigation and an independent review by the State Attorney's Office. Additionally, I have requested that the Department of Justice conduct its own investigation into these allegations and any pattern of behavior they might indicate." The assembled reporters erupted with questions. Monroe raised a hand for silence. "I have also personally reviewed Officer Torres's statement and the initial body camera footage from the night in question. Based on that review, I have reinstated Officer Torres to active duty, effective immediately." Robert sat forward, attention fully focused now. This was unexpected, a crack in the unified defense he had anticipated. "Let me be absolutely clear," Monroe said, his tone hardening. "If these allegations prove true, the officers involved will be terminated and their cases referred for criminal prosecution. The Miami Police Department will not tolerate abuse of power, racial profiling, or evidence tampering. Period." As the press conference ended, Robert's phone rang. It was Michael Washington. "Are you watching this?" Michael asked, not bothering with a greeting. Robert confirmed. "Interesting development." "More than interesting," Michael replied. "Monroe just threw Reynolds, Collins, and Mercer under the bus, and reinstating Torres. That's a clear signal. The question is why?" Robert mused. "Monroe's never been a reformer. If anything, he's been resistant to oversight." "I've got a theory," Michael said. "My contact in internal affairs says the body camera footage is damning, absolutely clear evidence of Collins planting the drugs. And not just from Torres's camera. Apparently Mercer's captured it too. From a different angle. They can't make it disappear because it's already been logged and viewed by multiple people. So Monroe's getting ahead of a scandal he can't contain." Robert concluded. "Exactly. And there's more. Remember those other complaints against Collins and Mercer that were dismissed? Word is that Internal Affairs is reopening all of them." Robert processed this information. "Monroe's cutting them loose to save himself and the department's reputation." "That's my read," Michael agreed. "The question is, do we press the advantage or wait to see how it plays out?" Robert didn't hesitate. "We'll press hard. Monroe's response is damage control, not real reform. We need to make it clear that this isn't just about two bad officers, it's about a system that protected them until it became too costly to do so." "I'll set up another press conference," Michael said, "and I think it's time we formally present our proposal for departmental reforms." After hanging up, Robert walked to his office and pulled out a document he had been refining for years, a comprehensive plan for police accountability and oversight. He had first drafted it during his tenure as Attorney General, but political resistance had prevented its full implementation. Now, perhaps, the moment had arrived to dust it off and give it new life. The document outlined a series of reforms: mandatory body cameras with footage automatically uploaded to secure servers accessible to defense attorneys and the public, a civilian oversight board with real disciplinary power, implicit bias training with measurable outcomes, an anonymous reporting system for officers to flag misconduct without fear of retaliation, and most controversially, an end to qualified immunity for officers who violated clearly established rights. Robert spent the morning updating the proposal, adding lessons learned from his own recent experience. By early afternoon, he had a document that was both visionary and practical, a blueprint for the kind of policing that served communities rather than controlling them. His phone rang again. An unfamiliar number. Robert answered cautiously. "Mr. Chambers, this is Richard Monroe." Robert's surprise lasted only a moment. "Chief Monroe, I was just watching your press conference." "I thought you might be," Monroe replied. "I'd like to meet with you privately. No press, no attorneys. Just a conversation." "About what exactly?" Robert asked, his tone neutral. "About how we move forward from here," Monroe said. "About making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." Robert considered the request. It could be a trap, an attempt to opt him or undermine the growing movement for reform. But it could also be an opportunity, a chance to advocate for change from the inside rather than forcing it from without. "When and where?" he finally asked. "My boat. This evening, 7 p.m. Just you and me. I'll text you the marina details." After Monroe hung up, Robert immediately called Michael Washington. "It could be a genuine olive branch," Michael said after hearing about the invitation. "Monroe's no fool. He knows this could define his legacy. Or it could be an attempt to neutralize me." Robert countered. "Bring me inside the tent, make me feel heard, then water down any real reforms." "What's your instinct?" Robert thought about it. "I think he's running scared. The body camera footage, Torres's testimony, the public pressure, it's all adding up to a nightmare for the department. He wants to regain control of the narrative." "Then use that," Michael advised. "Hear him out, but don't commit to anything without consulting me. And Robert, be careful. You've made some powerful enemies." That evening, Robert drove to a small marina in Coconut Grove. Monroe's boat turned out to be a modest fishing vessel, nothing flashy or ostentatious. The chief was alone, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a faded Miami Hurricanes polo shirt. He looked older, more tired than he had at the press conference. "Thank you for coming," Monroe said, offering a hand as Robert stepped aboard. "Beer?" Robert declined with a shake of his head. Monroe led him to the stern, where 2 deck chairs faced the setting sun. The city skyline glittered in the distance, the water lapping gently against the hull. "Beautiful evening," Monroe observed, settling into one of the chairs. "I come out here to think. Away from the politics, the pressure, the constant demands." Robert remained standing. "You didn't invite me here to discuss the weather or your contemplative habits, Chief Monroe." Monroe sighed. "No, I didn't." He gestured to the other chair. "Please, sit. This might take a while." Robert sat, but his posture remained alert, guarded. "I've been chief for 11 years, Monroe began. "Before that, 22 years on the force. I've seen changes, some good, some challenging. Body cameras, civilian oversight, social media capturing every interaction." He took a sip of his beer. "The job's different now. The old ways don't work anymore. They never worked." Robert replied evenly. "Not for everyone." Monroe nodded slowly. "That's fair. But here's where we are. Collins and Mercer are finished. The evidence is irrefutable. Internal Affairs has recommended termination, and the state attorney is preparing criminal charges for evidence tampering, false reporting, and civil rights violations." "That's a start," Robert acknowledged. "But it's just that, a start." "I know," Monroe said, surprising Robert with his candor. "The truth is, Chambers, I'm on my way out. Retirement in 8 months. I don't want my legacy to be a department in shambles, caught in a racism scandal that erodes public trust for years to come." "What are you proposing?" Monroe reached into a small cooler beside his chair and pulled out a folder. He handed it to Robert. "Take a look." Robert opened it to find a proposal for departmental reforms, many of them remarkably similar to his own plan. Mandatory body cameras, independent civilian oversight, implicit bias training, transparency in disciplinary proceedings. "Did you have someone watching my computer?" Robert asked, only half joking. Monroe almost smiled. "Great minds or desperate times. Either way, I need your help, Chambers. I need your credibility, your expertise, and frankly, your stamp of approval. I want to implement these reforms. Before I leave, make them my parting gift to the department and the city." Robert studied him, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. "Why me? Why not go through the usual channels?" "Because the usual channels are clogged with resistance and bureaucracy," Monroe admitted. "The union will fight tooth and nail. City council will worry about budget implications. Politicians will posture without action. But you have the moral authority to cut through all that." the former AG, the victim of police misconduct, now working with the department to ensure it never happens again. That's a narrative that can overcome the resistance. It was a compelling pitch, Robert had to admit, but he wasn't a man easily swayed by flattery or appeals to his ego. What's the catch? Monroe took another sip of his beer. The catch is that you softened some of your public criticism. Stop short of calling for my resignation or a complete departmental overhaul. Work with me, not against me, for these last 8 months. Robert considered the request, and if I refuse, then we proceed as adversaries, Monroe said matter-of-factly. I'll still push for reforms, but it will be harder, slower, with more resistance. You'll keep applying public pressure, filing lawsuits, demanding justice. Both paths lead to change, but one is collaborative, the other combative. The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across the deck. Robert weighed his options, the lessons of his long career providing context for this moment. I'll need guarantees, he finally said. Written commitments to specific reforms with concrete timelines, regular public updates on implementation, and complete transparency about the investigation into Collins Mercer and any officers facing similar complaints. Monroe nodded. Reasonable demands. Anything else? Yes, Robert said, leaning forward slightly. Officer Torres needs protection, not just physical security, but career protection. No retaliation, no punishment for doing the right thing. In fact, I want her promoted to a position where she can help implement these reforms. That might be pushing it. Monroe cautioned. The rank and file will see it as rewarding disloyalty. They need to see it as rewarding integrity. Robert countered. That's the cultural shift we're talking about. It starts with how you treat Torres. Monroe was silent for a long moment, then extended his hand. We have a deal, Chambers. I'll have my office draft the formal agreement tomorrow. Robert shook the offered hand, but his expression remained serious. Understand something, Chief Monroe. If at any point I sense that this is a delay tactic or a public relations ploy rather than a genuine commitment to change, I'll walk away and resume my campaign with even greater intensity. I'd expect nothing less, Monroe replied. As Robert drove home that night, he reflected on the unexpected turn of events. He had come seeking justice for himself and accountability for corrupt officers. Now he found himself potentially at the center of systemic reform. The very thing he had advocated for throughout his career. It was an opportunity, but also a risk. Working within the system meant compromise, potential co-option, the chance that real change would be diluted by institutional resistance. But standing outside, throwing stones at the walls of power, had its limitations too. Sometimes, change required both external pressure and internal champions willing to open doors from the inside. Robert decided to move forward with Monroe's proposal, but with eyes wide open. He would verify every promise, document every commitment, and hold the department accountable for real, measurable progress. The fight for justice was taking a new form, but its essence remained the same, ensuring that the law served all people equally, regardless of race, wealth, or status. It was the cause that had defined Robert Chambers's career, and would now define its next chapter. 3 months later, Robert stood at a podium in front of Miami Police Headquarters, Chief Monroe at his side. Behind them, a diverse group of community leaders, reform advocates, and police officers, including Officer Torres, recently promoted to head a new internal accountability unit. Today marks a significant step forward, Robert announced to the assembled press and public. The Miami Police Department is implementing a comprehensive reform package that will increase transparency, accountability, and trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The reforms, collectively dubbed the Chambers Initiative by the media, much to Robert's chagrin, included many of the measures he had long advocated for: mandatory body cameras, with footage accessible to defense attorneys, and civilian oversight, a strengthened civilian review board with disciplinary authority, implicit bias training with regular assessment, and protection for officers who reported misconduct. Most significantly, the department had agreed to an external audit of all complaints filed against officers in the past 5 years, with independent reviewers examining how those complaints were handled and whether patterns of misconduct had been overlooked. These changes won't happen overnight. Robert cautioned, reforming institutions takes time, persistence, and constant vigilance. But the commitment being made today represents a genuine desire to ensure that law enforcement serves justice rather than subverting it. Chief Monroe stepped to the microphone next. When I became chief 11 years ago, I believed that protecting officers meant defending them against all criticism. I've come to understand that true leadership means holding ourselves to the highest standards and acknowledging when we fail to meet them. He turned toward Robert. What happened to Mr. Chambers was inexcusable, a violation of his rights, and a betrayal of our oath to serve and protect. The officers responsible have been terminated and now face criminal charges. But addressing individual misconduct is not enough. We must also address the culture and systems that allowed it to occur. The press conference continued with questions from reporters, details about implementation timelines, and commitments from community leaders to engage constructively with the reform process. As Robert fielded questions, he noticed a familiar face at the back of the crowd: Trevor Banks, the young law student whose brother had been victimized by Collins and Mercer. Banks gave him a small nod of approval, a gesture that meant more to Robert than all the media coverage combined. Later that afternoon, Robert met with Michael Washington at his law firm to discuss the ongoing civil suit against the department. Despite the reforms, they had decided to proceed with the lawsuit to ensure accountability and compensation for all victims of Collins and Mercer. The criminal trial starts next month, Michael informed him. State Attorney Perez has assigned her best prosecutor. The evidence is overwhelming: body camera footage, Torres's testimony, consistent accounts from multiple victims. They don't have a chance. Don't underestimate their defense team, Robert cautioned. They'll attack Torres's credibility, suggest she had a grudge, claim the footage is misleading. That's why we've been preparing her so thoroughly, Michael assured him. She's ready, and with you testifying as well, the jury will see the pattern clearly. Robert nodded, then changed the subject. What about the other victims? How are they holding up? As well as can be expected, Michael said. Some are nervous about testifying, afraid of police retaliation. But seeing the reforms, seeing Torres promoted rather than punished, it's giving them courage. Good, Robert said. Because this isn't just about punishing Collins and Mercer. It's about setting a precedent that says no one is above the law, especially those entrusted with enforcing it. As the criminal trial approached, Robert continued to divide his time between teaching, consulting on the reforms, and preparing for his testimony. The stress was considerable, but he found purpose in the work, a sense that his career had been building toward this moment of potential transformation. One evening, as he was leaving the university after a late class, he found Officer Torres waiting beside his car. Mr. Chambers, she greeted him, her expression serious. I need to talk to you, privately. Once they were seated in his car, Torres lowered her voice. There's something you should know. Collins and Mercer weren't acting alone that night. They were part of a group within the department officers who targeted minorities for stops, planted evidence, shared tips on how to cover it up. Robert felt a chill despite the warm evening. How many? At least 8, maybe more, Torres said. They called themselves the clean-up crew. They believed they were ridding the streets of people they deemed undesirable, mostly black and Hispanic men in nice cars or white neighborhoods. And you have evidence of this? Torres nodded. I've been gathering it since my promotion. Meeting records, text messages, patterns in arrest data. It goes back years, and it involves officers in leadership positions, including Captain Reynolds. Robert processed this information. Have you shared this with Chief Monroe? Not yet, Torres admitted. I wanted to talk to you first. This could derail the reforms if not handled carefully. It could make the department look even worse than it already does. Or it could be the catalyst for even more significant change. Robert countered. Exposing the full extent of the problem might be painful, but it's necessary for genuine reform. Torres seemed relieved by his response. That's what I was hoping you'd say. I'll bring everything to Monroe tomorrow, with your backing. As she left, Robert remained in his car, contemplating the implications. The corruption was deeper, more organized than even he had suspected. The coming storm would be fierce, careers would end, reputations would be destroyed, the department would face a crisis of legitimacy unlike anything in its history. But from that crisis could emerge real transformation, not just policy changes on paper, but a fundamental shift in culture and practice. The kind of shift that Robert Chambers had spent his career fighting for. He started his car, determination settling over him like armor. The road ahead would be difficult, but he had never been one to turn away from a fight, especially one that mattered this much. The trial of officers Collins and Mercer began on a Monday morning in late summer. The courtroom was packed: media, community members, law enforcement officers, some supportive of the defendants, others there to witness justice. Robert sat in the front row beside Michael Washington, his posture perfect, his expression composed. The prosecution's case was methodical, devastating. Body camera footage showed Collins clearly planting evidence. Torres's testimony was unwavering, even under aggressive cross-examination. Multiple victims recounted similar experiences: traffic stops without cause, searches without consent, evidence appearing mysteriously. When Robert took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He recounted that night with precision, without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. The defense attempted to suggest that his prominence had prompted special treatment, that the reforms were an overreaction to a misunderstanding. "Mr. Chambers," the defense attorney asked, "isn't it possible that in the darkness, from your perspective, you misinterpreted Officer Collins's actions? That what you perceived as planting evidence was simply him discovering something you weren't aware was there?" Robert's response was measured but firm. "The body camera footage shows exactly what happened. Officer Collins reached into his pocket, removed a bag of white powder, and placed it near my feet. There is no room for interpretation or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to frame me for a crime I did not commit." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict guilty on all counts. Collins and Mercer were immediately taken into custody, their expressions shocked, as if they had never truly believed they would be held accountable for their actions. As Robert left the courtroom that day, he was met by a group of community members, families who had been affected by police misconduct, activists who had been fighting for reform for years, young people who had grown up fearing rather than trusting law enforcement. "Thank you," an elderly woman said, taking his hand in both of hers. "My grandson was arrested by Collins 5 years ago. Drug charges. He always said they were planted, but nobody believed him. Now maybe they will." Robert was moved by her words, by all the stories shared with him that day. This was why the fight mattered, not for abstract principles, but for real lives affected by injustice. 2 days later, Torres's evidence about the clean-up crew was presented to Chief Monroe. As predicted, it caused an earthquake within the department. Reynolds was immediately suspended pending investigation. The other implicated officers were placed on administrative leave. Local and national media covered the revelations extensively, with headlines describing systemic corruption and organized misconduct within the Miami Police Department. Monroe, to his credit, did not attempt to minimize or excuse what had been uncovered. In a press conference that some described as the most honest public statement ever given by a police chief, he acknowledged the depth of the problem and committed to rooting it out completely. "This department has failed in its most fundamental duty to uphold the law equally for all citizens," Monroe admitted. "That failure isn't limited to a few bad officers. It's a failure of leadership, of oversight, of culture. And fixing it will require more than policy changes. It will require a complete reassessment of who we are and how we serve." In the following weeks, the reforms that had been initiated following Robert's case were expanded and accelerated. The external audit was broadened to examine all arrests made by members of the clean-up crew over the past decade. The Civilian Oversight Board was granted additional powers. Training was overhauled, with a focus not just on tactics but on ethics and community engagement. Most significantly, a bill was introduced in the state legislature, the Law Enforcement Accountability and Transparency Act, informally known as the Chambers Act, It would require all police departments in Florida to implement reforms similar to those being adopted in Miami. Mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight, whistleblower protections, and regular external audits of complaint patterns. Robert was asked to testify before the legislative committee considering the bill. As he sat before the lawmakers, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment from a traffic stop, meant to humiliate him to a potential landmark in police reform. "What happened to me was not unique," he told the committee. "What is unique is that I had the resources, knowledge, and platform to fight back effectively. Most victims of police misconduct do not. They face a system designed to dismiss their complaints, doubt their credibility, and protect those who abuse power." He leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. "This bill isn't anti-police. It's pro-justice. It protects both citizens from abuse and honest officers from being tarnished by association with those who betray their oath. It creates accountability where there has been impunity, transparency where there has been secrecy, and trust where there has been fear." The committee room was silent when he finished. Even lawmakers who had initially been skeptical seemed moved by his testimony. Outside the Capitol building afterward, a young reporter asked him if he felt vindicated by all that had transpired since that night on a Miami street. Robert considered the question carefully. Vindication implies personal satisfaction, and this isn't about me. It's about creating a system where justice isn't dependent on who you are, what you look like, or what resources you have. We're not there yet, not by a long shot. But we're moving in the right direction. 6 months later, the Chambers Act passed the Florida legislature by a narrow margin. It wasn't perfect, compromises had been made to secure enough votes, but it represented the most significant police reform in the state's history. On the day Governor Sandra Alvarez signed it into law, Robert stood among a diverse group of advocates, legislators, reformed-minded law enforcement officials, and victims of police misconduct. Officer Torres, now Lieutenant Torres, heading the expanded Internal Accountability Unit, stood nearby, her once uncertain posture now confident and assured. As the ceremony concluded, Robert found himself face to face with Trevor Banks and his brother Marcus, the law student, and his sibling who had been falsely arrested by Collins and Mercer years earlier. "Professor Chambers," Trevor said, shaking Robert's hand firmly. "Marcus's record has been expunged. He's applying to law school now." Marcus, a young man with intelligent eyes and a cautious demeanor, nodded. "I never thought I'd see this day. Never thought anyone would believe what happened to me." "The work isn't done," Robert told him. "Laws are only as effective as their implementation. We'll need people like you and your brother to hold the system accountable, to ensure these reforms aren't just words on paper." "That's the plan," Marcus said with newfound determination. "Trevor's graduation is next month. I'm hoping to follow him in a few years. We want to start a practice together, civil rights law." Robert felt a surge of hope at these words. This, perhaps more than anything else, was the true measure of progress, young people who had experienced injustice choosing to dedicate their lives to fighting it, rather than being defeated by it. 1 year to the day after that fateful traffic stop, Robert Chambers stood before his constitutional law class at the University of Miami. The room was fuller than usual. Students from other courses had come to hear him speak on this anniversary that had taken on almost symbolic significance. "Justice," he began, "is not an abstraction. It's not a concept to be debated in classrooms or philosophized about in chambers. It's a living, breathing reality that affects people's lives every day, sometimes in dramatic ways, often in quiet ones that never make the headlines." He paced slowly across the front of the room, making eye contact with each student. 1 year ago today, I experienced firsthand what millions of Americans, particularly Black Americans, have faced for generations: the arbitrary exercise of power unconstrained by law or accountability. What made my case unusual wasn't what happened, but the response to it, the refusal to let it be ignored, explained away, or buried in bureaucracy. The room was silent, every student fully engaged. The reforms that have emerged from that incident, the departmental changes, the Chambers Act, the ongoing investigations, these are important. But they are means, not ends. The true goal is a system where justice is not a privilege for the powerful, but a right for everyone. Where law enforcement is accountable to the communities it serves, where the protections guaranteed by our Constitution are realities, not just promises on paper. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the eager faces before him. That goal remains distant. The work continues, and all of you, as future lawyers, judges, legislators, and citizens, have a role to play in that work. The question is not whether you will engage with the justice system. You will, in one way or another. The question is whether you will accept it as it is, or commit to making it what it should be. As class ended and students began filing out, many stopped to speak with him briefly, to thank him, to ask questions, to share their own stories of encounters with law enforcement. It was nearly an hour before the room cleared, leaving Robert alone with his thoughts. He gathered his materials slowly, reflecting on all that had transpired in the year since that traffic stop. Collins and Mercer were serving prison sentences. Reynolds and 4 other officers implicated in the clean-up crew were awaiting trial. Monroe had retired as planned, his legacy a department in the midst of painful but necessary transformation. Torres had become the face of reform within the force, mentoring young officers and rebuilding community trust. And Robert himself had found a new chapter in his career, not just teaching, not just consulting on reforms, but actively engaging in the ongoing work of bending the arc of justice. His upcoming book, Beyond the Badge: Reimagining Policing in America, was already generating significant interest. His testimony was being sought in similar cases across the country. It wasn't the retirement he had envisioned when he left the Attorney General's office years earlier. It was something more demanding, more consuming, and ultimately more meaningful. As he left the classroom that evening, he paused to look at a framed quote he had hung on his office door, words from Justice Thurgood Marshall that had guided him throughout his career. In recognizing the humanity of our fellow beings, we pay ourselves the highest tribute. That recognition of shared humanity across races, across roles, across the divisions that so often separated people, was at the heart of true justice. It was what Collins and Mercer had failed to do on that Miami street. It was what Torres had found the courage to uphold. And it was what Robert Chambers would continue to fight for. One case, one reform, one mind at a time. The journey toward justice was long, with no final destination. But every step mattered. Every voice raised, every system challenged, every moment of accountability created. These were the building blocks of progress. Robert switched off his office light and headed home, already planning tomorrow's battles in the never-ending campaign for a justice system worthy of its name. For as he had learned throughout his distinguished career, and been reminded so powerfully in the past year, justice was not just a concept to be taught or a principle to be defended. It was a daily practice, a constant vigilance, and ultimately, the most essential guardian of human dignity and democratic society. And as long as he had breath in his body, Robert Chambers would stand as a guardian of that guardian, challenging it when it failed, supporting it when it succeeded, and always demanding that it live up to its highest ideals, not just for him, not just for those with voices powerful enough to be heard, but for everyone.